Welcome. I'm Karen Chance-McCurious, the Director of Alumni Relations at Harvard Law School, and I'll be your host for today's session. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our featured faculty speakers, Professor Tyler Giannini and Htun. Tyler Giannini is a clinical professor of law at Harvard Law School, where he also co-directs the HLS Human Rights Program as well as the International Human Rights Clinic. Tyler got his start in the field working to protect human rights in Myanmar in the mid-1990s, and he's worked on Burma since then. Prior to coming to HLS in 2004, he was the founder and director of Earth Rights International, an organization at the forefront of efforts to link human rights and environmental protection. Htun is the director of Myanmar Program for Justice Trust, a legal nonprofit that partners with lawyers and activists to strengthen communities fighting for justice and human rights. She also serves as a clinical advocacy fellow for the HLS Human Rights Program. Yi has more than 10 years of international advocacy experience working on behalf of refugee and migrant communities. Yi was born in Myanmar and left the country after the pro-democratic uprising in 1988. She immigrated to Canada as a government-sponsored refugee. All participants in today's HLeX open lecture will have the opportunity to submit questions. Please use the questions panel on your screen at any time during the presentation. We will be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. Tyler and Yi, welcome.
Thank you, Karen. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be in this virtual conversation with people around the world. We understand there are people from around the world, both in the United States and abroad, so it's really a pleasure to be here and speaking with you today. We're going to be covering a wide range of things today, and just to give you a sense of where we are going, we are first going to, for a few minutes, just cover a little introduction to what the clinic does more generally, and then we're going to get straight to the Myanmar work. There are a few slides in the show which are somewhat graphic, so we wanted to just let you be aware of that. We'll try to tell you when that's coming, including the next slide, actually. So let's move to that slide. So just as a little bit of an introduction, and this is graphic because this is a Buddhist monk from Burma who was injured in attacks, and he has white phosphorus burns, which you can see on his right arm there in the photo. Our clinic is a rather large one. We have 6 clinical supervisors, and we work with more than 40 students a term on more than 15 to 20 projects. That spans the world. Some of the areas we're working on this year, just to give you a sense of the geographic scope of what we're doing beyond Myanmar, include active litigation coming out of events in 2003 and extrajudicial killings involving the military and security forces in Bolivia. We have active work going on related to violence in Colombia, and we are also working with issues related to Syrian refugees. We also do work that is comparative in nature, so we have an active project related to Islamic law and its compliance with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, so the CEDAW Convention. And one of our senior clinical instructors is also very active with civilian protection in armed conflict, so looking at weapons that have a disproportionate impact on civilians during armed conflict. So I could cover a lot more than that, but that gives you kind of a sense of what we do in the clinic, and I want to get us to the conversation about Myanmar. So if you signed up for this, you probably know where the country is, but there's the map. We're in Southeast Asia. And what we're hoping to do today is really cover 3 different things. So we want to go back to the history, because it's actually very important to a conversation about transition. And we're going to start with the independence period, which is 1948, and then the military rule comes and starts in 1962. And then key dates that we're going to go into briefly, we're not going to spend too much time on the history, is 1988 and 1990, when there was an election that was not recognized. That's really the period of time, that military rule period, where things are pretty black and white. And so that's the pre-transition. Then things get much more complicated with an election in 2010 and the election in 2015, which brought the National League for Democracy to power. So that's that second period we want to cover, is how things got complicated in the gray period during a transition. And then we're going to end with a discussion of our activities in the last year and how the NLD, the National League for Democracy, has been working over the last year and where rights need to be a focus currently, but also looking forward. So that's where we're headed. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Yi.
Thank you very much, Tyler. It is a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you virtually in this conversation. And before I begin talking about my country of birth, where it's been, where it's heading, I just wanted to take a moment to mention a colleague of mine who's passed away tragically earlier this week. His name is Htun. Some of you may have heard about him in the news reports. He was a top legal advisor to the National League for Democracy, a leading scholar and a constitutional law expert. Htun believed in a democratic and free Myanmar, one where rule of law and human rights was enshrined and prevailed, and his life was tragically cut short and taken from us this past Sunday, and I'd like to take this moment to dedicate this lecture and talk about this country in the hopes that we can one day realize his dream, and inshallah that he will be proud of us somewhere. So the first period, as Tyler mentioned, talking about the history, I am going to tell you a bit about what it was like for me as a person born in Myanmar, what it was like growing up under military rule. So Myanmar experienced a period of brief democracy shortly after it gained independence from England in 1945. So between 1945 and 1962, it did have a period of democracy with functioning judiciary and relative freedom. But by the time I was born, which was in the 80s, the military coup had taken place in 1962, which meant that it was almost 2 decades into the military dictatorship. Things that I took for normal in my country of birth, I later came to discover were in fact not normal. For instance, I remember the atmosphere of having adults talking in hushed tones because you couldn't convene in public spaces to talk about politics, to talk about generals, or even talk about what I would call the good old days when there was freedom and democracy in the country. We would get regular televised visits in our homes, usually issued by top military generals such as General Ne Win, talking about successful military campaigns they had waged to protect those of us in the country from savage ethnic rebels who were seeking to destroy the national unity and security. Of course, the real narrative is another different story, and I'll come to that. But since 1962, when the military gained power, different ethnic groups in all over the country had been trying to gain representation and ability to have their rights, but when those negotiations broke down, the Myanmar Tamil has been engaged in forms of conflict with different ethnic communities. Going back to the atmosphere of what it was like under military rule, it was very common for us to be stopped in the streets with soldiers, had to cross military checkpoints to go to school, to come home, or have squads of armed individuals coming to search our houses and making sure that nobody who was not supposed to be there was there. So the memory of the uprising that Tyler briefly mentioned and why it was so important was that this was after more than several decades of military rule. People had reached a tipping point where their demands for democracy was not being heard, and the whole country organized to march in protest, and it was a nationwide, it was felt all throughout the country, people from all walks of life, different groups marching in unity for this. So I was 7 years old at the time. I remember seeing memories of thousands upon thousands of crowds chanting, protesting, hearing things like democracy and freedom. And our family lived right across from the city hall, so that was the epicenter of the protests and the heart where these people had gathered. Now, the whole country, and even those of us who grew up then, hoped that perhaps this would be a point where we would finally get that dream of democracy and things would be much more free for my country of birth, but alas, that was not to be. On August 8, 1988, the most violent day of the brutal crackdown. Troop reinforcements in all different parts of the world, of the country, but specifically Yangon, arrived. I remember the adults in our family moving those of us children back to the back of the house as soldiers began indiscriminately firing into the crowds of protesters. I remember hearing screaming. I thought it wouldn't ever end. It went on and on. All I remember was the next day waking up and seeing all those protesters that I had seen who had been gathering for more than months were gone all of a sudden, and the city workers were hosing down the streets. And a few months after the 88 uprising, as it would happen, was told that our family had to leave. At the time, in my childhood moment, I thought it was a family vacation, and having never really left the country, thinking that how fun it would be to go to Thailand and see it. But little did I know it was just that the situation, the political situation had deteriorated. I had a family member who was involved in organizing these peaceful strikes through the medicine, and had treated injured protesters. And as a result, we were essentially going to be targeted and arrested. So we fled the country, which ended up meaning that I ended up in Thailand in the various refugee camps. It was there in Thailand that I got a real sense of hearing the other side. All our childhood we were told about this ethnic rebels, evil groups who want to destroy unity, but the reality was I got to see firsthand in these camps what it meant to be ethnic refugees fleeing from the persecution. I met children my own age, very young, who always talked about their villages being burned and ransacked. They had to be ready to run anytime a Damadaw, or the Burmese military's name is Damadaw, the Damadaw infantry and battalion would roll into their villages. And there were a few times that we felt that perhaps we could go back, perhaps these refugees and ourselves could return to our country of birth. And one of these points was the 1990 election. The whole country had been really hopeful that the Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy, her party, won those elections by a landslide of more than 82% of the seats. We thought this was the window of opportunity, finally democracy, we could go back. But the State Law and Order and Restoration Council, or SLORC as it was known, refused to honor the election results. They imprisoned the MPs, including the lady herself, and that was when we realized that we wouldn't be going home, and I became a government-sponsored refugee and immigrated to Canada. And I thought I would now hand back to Tyler to tell you a bit about that period of the 90s and how when he came to the border.
Thanks, Yi. And we, in getting ready for the discussion today, Yi and I compared notes on when Yi left for Canada. It was 1994, and that's the same year that I came to the Thai-Burmese border for the first time. I was actually in law school. It was my second year of law school. And from that second year of law school, I, along with a classmate and a man from Burma, decided that we would start Earthrights. And it was to focus on the abuses that were coming out of, that were occurring in the country that Yi has already spoken about. And there was really one moment that kind of brought that together for us, as the three of us, to get started on that. I still remember Katie, who was my classmate, and I sitting in one of those camps along the Thai-Burmese border, and we were looking at whether there was displacement related to a proposed dam site. And we were looking at the map, and we were talking to one of these students who'd fled in 1988. He was actually a medical student, but now he was actually fighting against the military. And his question to us as we're looking at the dam site was, my question for you is whether under international law we can attack that as a legitimate site, a legitimate target, military target. And so it brought home for us that at least along the border, everyone was thinking in terms of military. They weren't thinking in terms of the rule of law. And whether it's certainly understandable that people would want to pick up guns if they see their village burned, if they see their loved ones killed. But it was very clear that very intelligent individuals did not know the nonviolent alternatives that might be available. And that's what spurred on the idea to start Earthrights. And other groups since the 1990s have also done similar things, and I think that's a theme for us, is where's the rule of law in this situation? How do you end this cycle of violence that's been going on for 6 and 7 decades so that people don't need to continue to flee the country the way he did? And that was a theme that we would see over and over again, that people would flee, people with Yi's talent would flee the country, and so how do you build a country if talented leaders are not there? Fast forwarding to over a decade and the time in the clinic, most of the work that was being done on documenting in the 1990s and the early 2000s was focused on human rights violations. And then around 2008, there was a question about whether these were actually international crimes. And so the analysis went from, is this a human rights violation only, or should it actually be considered an international crime? And the clinic did a report in 2009, which was released, called Crimes in Burma. And our basic conclusion was that based on just looking at UN documents, we just looked at UN reports by special rapporteurs, by the ILO, by other institutions, there was a prima facie case that international crimes were taking place, and there needed to be a commission of inquiry by the UN. So this predates the first election that I mentioned earlier. And based on, there was a big push by civil society around the world to have that commission of inquiry adopted, but it was not adopted at the UN level because the Chinese actually were going to block it if you pushed for it too much. But we were also getting a question at that point during that year of 2009 to 2010 about whether you actually could put together a case against individuals. Policy makers were asking the clinic that. So we went and we talked to local groups as well, and we decided as a clinic that we would actually see if we could put together a case. And so we undertook a 4-year investigation from 2010 to 2014, looking at whether, in fact, you could gather evidence at a criminal standard, so the international criminal standard, of abuses, and looking at whether there are, in fact, commanders that you could bring a case against. And so we did what we understand to be the most in-depth investigation into one offensive in a particular area. It was in eastern Burma on the Thai-Burmese border, and we looked at one district. And so we then looked at the commanders and their roles, and we concluded, and there's a little bit more text on here than most of the slides, but it's really important. Our basic conclusion was that we did have sufficient evidence to meet the standard under the Rome Statute, or the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to issue an arrest warrant. And that was a critical conclusion. Then this particular commander, so we investigated 3 commanders. The one that I want to identify here was that the investigation we looked at was during an offensive in 2005 and 2006, and from there, the commander who was in charge of the entire area was actually promoted. And he wasn't promoted once, he was promoted several times. And by the time we were releasing the report in 2014, we started in 2010, he was actually the Myanmar Home Affairs Minister. His name is Major General Koko. Now, there's a key shift during this investigation. We started before the first election in 2010, and it's not a free and fair election, but it's an important election because it's the first time that you have some form of election since 1990 in the country. And the president was then saying he's a former general, so essentially what you had is generals taking off their military uniforms, but they were elected. And this is the beginning of the question about is there actually a transition coming. But you can see just with Major General Koko that you have people involved in serious, egregious violations that we felt could result in an arrest warrant actually in key ministerial positions in the government at that time. Okay, so that brings us to this discussion of transition. And back to Yi to pick that up.
Thank you, Tyler. So with regards to the transition, as Tyler mentioned, by 2010, we've got this sort of changing period from the military, outright military, to pseudo quasi-civilian rule. We had President Thein Sein at the time, and for me that was also the sort of the period where I decided to go back, because the country was opening up, activists were taken off the blacklist and allowed back into the country. At the time, I had already been working on international human rights and women's rights issues globally, but when the opportunity came up to return to my country of birth, I just couldn't pass it up. It had definitely changed Myanmar when I returned from the childhood atmosphere that I had told you earlier in this session. I noticed, for instance, civil society actors were just organizing. There was a real sense of cautious optimism in the air. There was a lot more discussion, open discussions in public spaces about politics. You had a degree of freedom as far as the journalists and media goes. But I want to highlight the one thing as to why we put a question mark in this transition, and that was because even though you have these sort of changes that were taking place and opening up, there were still certain structural elements that ensured that a lot of the previous, be it in the forms of people like General Koko, the previous military linkages were still very much in play. In addition to which, in 2008, the Myanmar's military had enacted the Constitution. And the Constitution is a key factor when we're talking about this transition, because it has certain provisions that ensure that military control remains in this country from that point on, and it still continues to this day. For instance, in the Constitution, it's written that 25% of the seats in both houses are reserved for military armed forces. As you can see from the picture there, that is the area of the parliament that are seated by these individuals. You've also got key ministries ranging from home affairs to borders that are effectively under the commander-in-chief, that the civilian government actually never has oversight over. There are provisions in this constitution that denies Aung San Suu Kyi from ever becoming president simply because she had married a foreigner, and that was one of the clauses that was written in it. And there was essentially effective immunity clauses listed in certain parts for crimes that had taken place. Some of these crimes that Tyler mentioned about that we had seen on the border for the ethnic groups, the crimes that had taken place against different communities can never be held accountable in a court of law. A civilian court, the military tribunals have oversight, and the same applies for the police as well, because they're all under the commander-in-chief, overseen through the Minister of Home Affairs. So one of the things that I did when I went back in was I worked with an international legal nonprofit group, and our work was focused on supporting local lawyers and vulnerable communities. We help offer technical support and capacity building and try to bring lawsuits with local partners. So I wanted to mention two cases on, and I probably should warn that the next slide is graphic, and that's the case that I think for me very much reveals that the old Burma, not this new Myanmar that we've been told, but the old Burma is still very much alive. It's simply that these powers are legitimized by the 2008 Constitution. So Leopardon took place during this transition period. It was around 2012 in November. There was a joint venture between a Burmese military company and a Chinese military company. They wanted to do an open pit copper mine in the region. There were a lot of villagers and monks who had protested because it was a holy site and they didn't want the environment degradation taking place in their community, so they protested peacefully, and in response, the police, under orders of Minister of Home Affairs, Koko, whom Tyler mentioned, actually attacked the protester with white phosphorus smoke grenades, resulting in grievous, serious injuries. As you can see, this is one of our clients. Since then, our organization has tried to bring lawsuits in the domestic jurisdiction regarding this case. This is clear evidence of violations documented back by medical support, and it's been blocked at every turn. We've tried to bring a case before the Supreme Court, but the basic requirements such as affidavits. There's not a single court registry that will certify our affidavit. We've been told by court clerks saying, essentially, if you don't mention Leopardon, if you don't mention the night of, if you don't bring out any of the evidence of white phosphorus, just say the monks were there, they got injured. 2 words, we can certify it. But that sort of takes the essence of what we're trying to do. So to this day, these injured monks and villagers have yet to see justice and has been blocked. Another case that I wanted to mention that the clinic has also involved in this period, and this was a case that really bridges the 2 periods, the Thein Sein government and then the newly elected Aung San Suu Kyi National League for Democracy-led government of 2015 election. So Leopardon involved students who were protesting this new law, and they were calling for educational reform. They had organized students all around the country, very similar to 88, but this was purely focused on educational reform. They had peacefully marched from Mandalay, which is in middle Burma, to come down. And for the time being, because this was the opening up period, there was a real sense that people felt perhaps they would be allowed to protest. It is, after all, a right that's enshrined even in the 2008 Constitution, freedom of assembly. But that was not to be, because in March of 2015, as they were coming close to Yangon with their list of demands, they were blocked at a police blockade, and huge swaths of police battalions organized and beat, indiscriminately beat with batons hundreds of students and supporters. In addition to sustaining injuries, most of these villagers and student leaders were detained and put on trial. I worked with the communities, their parents of the detainees, trying to organize to free them and work with human rights lawyers to represent them. They've tried to countersue for the injuries that they sustained, but that lawsuit too has been blocked, and in fact the trial went on and on for over a year, and it was only when the new government was sworn in and came into power in March 2016 that these students were released and reunited with their families. So I wanted to tell you about these 2 cases because I think that shows to you, even in this period of transition, just sort of the realities on the ground. And I'm going to hand back to Tyler so he can tell you a bit more about the elections of 2015.
And so the election in 2015 was an election, unlike the one in 2010, that we can consider to be free and fair. It's really the first open election since 1990, and probably everybody on the call knows that was won in a landslide by the National League for Democracy. But as Yi said, Aung San Suu Kyi, who's the leader of the NLD, was not able to take the presidency, the position of being president. So through a creative process, they created a new position called the state counselor. And so Aung San Suu Kyi is effectively still the leader of the government, even though there is a president, and they work closely together. But the key thing here is that, yes, this is now a civilian government. So another step forward. However, it's also brought up questions about what's the interaction between the civilian government and the military, because the military still holds these key positions that Yi has spoken about. So what we wanted to do was to now kind of outline some of the key questions present right now, and then hopefully we can handle them in more depth in questions. So there are really 3 big issues that we see right now in terms of rights. The first is that there are ceasefires and questions of peace. The second is there is really a crisis around the Rohingya, which is a group of Muslims mostly in the western part of the country, but not entirely. And then there are still these open questions about whether you're going to get the kind of structural change that you need to have a rights culture in place. So just to highlight these quite quickly through the acute rights violations and really live issues that are happening right now in a few places, these 2. The first one is to focus on the north and the Kachin conflict with the military. And there's a lot of history here. The short history on this is that the Kachin group entered into a ceasefire with the Burmese military in 1994, And that ceasefire was broken in 2011 by offensives by the Burmese military. And since 2011, there have been tens of thousands of people displaced in the area, and that took place during the previous administration, so President Thein Sein. In the last few months, there has been additional offensives in the area and more displacement. I don't have time to go into all the details, but thousands of people have been displaced again. There have been civilian deaths, and the humanitarian situation is quite acute in the north. And so what you have is, despite a civilian government in place, you still have active fighting in the area. This is also happening in the background of a national ceasefire agreement that was signed more than a year ago, but in fact it was not actually national because not all the groups that have been involved in the civil over the last 70 years signed it, and it's pretty clear from the active fighting in the north that it's actually not a ceasefire. So that ceasefire agreement that's in place is question mark. The clinic's done some legal analysis around it as well, and now there is a peace process that is also in question because of this ongoing fighting. The second area is the Rohingya in the western area of the country in a state called Rakhine State, so it's near Bangladesh. And here again there have been decades of human rights issues in the area, ranging from economic, social, and cultural rights issues like health and education and food, but also more acutely around people's citizenship rights and then violence. Under the Thein Sein administration, there was a widespread violence that took place in 2012, displaced more than 100,000 people that were put into camps, and the conditions are quite damaging for them, and some groups have labeled this as crimes against humanity, and some people say it's preconditions for genocide even. And so this is actually quite an active issue in the area, and now under the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, there has been violence that's erupted since October. So some individuals in the area who may actually be forming a new resistance group. There's conflicting reports in the area, but it does look like there may be some more active resistance in the area, so things are spiraling in the wrong way. Attacked several police stations, resulting in 9 deaths, and now the military and the security forces have responded, and so this, what I'm showing you here, is a satellite image of a village. And essentially what we're getting is the same sort of patterns that you see in the north in Kachin State, or with the investigation that the clinic did in 2005. And so to go to an after, this is from over the last couple of months. If you look here, hopefully you can see the cursor, each of these is burned homes. And we're talking about documentation by Human Rights Watch, satellite imagery, about more than 1,000 structures. There has been an interim investigation which has largely been inconclusive or said that there are not violations, which we can get into in questions, but this kind of highlights, again, the ongoing violence that's occurring and a lot of the same patterns despite the election that we've seen for decades, unfortunately. So that leaves us with mixed feelings about where we are, and I think what we wanted to kind of get into now is what we are doing over the last year, and it's really been under Yi's leadership. And I think one of the things that we are hopeful about is that if I look at what the clinic was doing in 2014 with the release of that report and the focus on cocoa, it was still a question mark about whether that's the best way to do it and focus on outside international work. But now we have a chance to work with people like Yi and other leaders in the country, and they're going to stay in the country, and they can build up civil society and the rule of law, hopefully, from within the country. And so the clinic is now focused on that. And the goal here is really so that we don't see the regression in rights, but that we can actually get some structural change. So Yi, back to you to close us out.
Thank you, Tyler, for those compliments as well as telling us about the road forward, so to speak. So I think from Tyler's presentation, it's pretty certain, and there's no denying that there's a lot to be done to contest the old structures in Myanmar. But I personally feel that there is cause for optimism in that civil society actors are engaged and they're working for change. They're taking the lead and taking the initiative. So the key now is to ensure that they get the support, and I'm really grateful to the clinic and here at the law school in helping provide that support. And it is for the road forward for us in order to not regress is to ensure that marginalized voices that with the vision for change get included into the conversations. We worked on projects and different initiatives that will strengthen that. I want to share with you some photos, and one such initiative that the clinic organized last year, which was in April 2016, was to do this training called an op-ed project training where we convened women's rights leaders from all over the country working on different issues in different regions. They were multi-ethnic, multi-faith women, and we offered them a chance to give them tools of how they could become thought leaders and influencers of bringing change. It was a great convening. I think some of that network and that sisterhood, that bond that we developed in those sessions are very much alive today, and those campaigns that we're supporting are really, I think it's really laid in the seed of that project, and it's still flourishing. And I think that's where the hope lies, that we give the capacity and the support and the people that needs it, and then letting them lead and stuff. So I'm particularly very grateful that this year, for this academic year alone, I've had the fortune of being able to have the freedom to work with my local partners inside Myanmar, working on issues related to women's rights, analyzing laws using Harvard Law students, looking at comparative legal experiences, compiling best practices to advance, whether it's women's rights, LGBTQI rights, law reform, model legislation, having the students help do legal research as well as developing model legislation, helping profile certain cases related to freedom of expression. So these are just to give you a sense of what the clinic does, and I really think that that sort of partnership and relationship with the school and also doing projects like this is the only way we can entrench rights and create a rights-based culture in Myanmar. So thank you very much for all your time, and I think Tyler and I are going to hand it back to Karen to kind of wrap up the session for us.
Thanks again to Tyler and Yi. If you'd like to review any part of today's webinar, the recording of this program will be available online next week. Please note that in order to get your questions answered, you need to type them and submit them into the questions panel on the screen. Please do so now. We have a number of questions that have come in, and we'll see how many we can get to. The first question: have charges being brought before the International Criminal Court? If so, what happened? If not, why not?
We can both take that question, but you go ahead.
So there's jurisdictionally, the only way that you can move before the International Criminal Court with regards to Myanmar is if they have signed the Rome Statute. They have not, and since they have not, the only way that you could move this is through the Security Council. So I made reference to the fact that China was opposed to even starting a commission of inquiry, and so there's no way that you can refer the situation to the ICC. So there's no current case before the ICC with regards to Myanmar. And so the investigation was really aimed at trying to focus attention on the fact that crimes were taking place and hopefully to push for change in behavior. I think it's good now that Coco is no longer the Home Affairs Minister, but there are still these issues with regards to the practice of civilian control over the military. So hopefully these are incremental changes, but there's so much more in terms of the kind of accountability that you're referencing with your question.
Thank you. Another question. What can be done by a listener to get involved in what you're doing?
I think one of the ways that you could get involved is, reach out to us. We have a lot of linkages with partners on the ground, a lot of people where your legal expertise and support is needed and could be of great benefit. So we hope that you'll stay in touch and we can have further conversations off-site with regards to your interests or particular roles of where and how you may be able to get involved there.
I would say often that, just to supplement on that, I think that one thing that, since this is probably mostly lawyers on the phone here, there's a need for legal capacity building inside the country. So depending on whether you wanted to support that sort of work, this is the kind of thing that we would be able to explore with you about what kind of time you might have available to assist with capacity or actually active research or things like that.
Another question. To what extent are ethnic majority citizens, for example, who voted for the NLD in 2015, aware of and concerned by violence against ethnic minorities outside of cities? Does the perception of ethnic rebels threatening national unity still persist?
I think that narrative has, to a certain degree, been faded over time. I think even the majority Burman would take to heart that was a narrative that was very much at the heart of the military heydays. I think there is degree of uncertainty. Certainly, I think majority of ethnic groups and people who are belonging to different ethnic minority groups want self-representation and want federalism, which is the main aspiration that they've been striving for since the early 60s. As far as the majority goes, I think that the armed conflict, even what's happening in the Kachin state, whether you have allegiances or feelings regarding the Kachin Independence Army, KIA, the ethnic armed group, regardless of that, I think peace is something that is desired, whether you're in a majority area or belonging to an ethnic minority.
And I think one dimension that you're getting at beyond just the kind of is there violence has there been any sort of reconciliation? Because the divide for so many decades was that if you were in the center of the country, so in Yangon or Mandalay, you wouldn't travel to ethnic nationality regions. And so you're really only thinking about the last 5 or 6 years that things have opened up. And that's not really enough time to build that understanding and overcome the prejudices, even if it has started to fade and people are starting to understand. And without a dialogue and a conversation about peace, and without a conversation that's openly talking about the traumatic events of decades of the past, it's hard to have that sort of reconciliation.
Another question. In light of the ongoing use of criminal laws against those peacefully criticizing the military or the government, what work, if any, is the clinic doing to encourage reform of those laws?
I think perhaps the question, the person who posed this question is looking at the telecommunications law that's been used to target activists. Actually, one of the projects that the clinic is doing this semester here in the spring is working with civil society actors inside the country. There's a campaign underway to try and repeal those laws. We're analyzing the telecommunication law, or specifically that criminal defamation provision under 66D, looking at the international standards and proposing ways in which it could be either repealed, offering model arguments or best practices around that, and also helping local lawyers make best arguments around defending individuals who may be charged with 6060. So we are very much tapped into that movement and also working to offer technical and legal expertise on this area.
Another question. There must be several organizations, both at other law schools and otherwise, working on these issues. Is there a form of coordination among these concerned groups to avoid duplication and/or counterproductive activity?
So I think the short answer to that is yes, there is coordination. Does it lead to complete non-duplication? No, but there is certainly coordination. And I think one area where you see that, for example, is around what's called the Universal Periodic Review process that happened with regards to Myanmar. There were multiple players submitting reports. As a UN process. It's a review of the human rights situation in the country. And there was coordination happening locally and also internationally. And I think this is an example of this shift. I think if you had talked 5 years ago, most of the conversation probably would have been between international groups. There might have been a separate one domestically, but they wouldn't have been tied, and the international groups would have set things themselves. Now there's much more what you see is what's just the priorities of the domestic groups and how do the international groups support that. So that's a big shift, the kind of thing that we're talking about. It also happens between clinics, for example. Cornell was supporting on CEDAW. We were supporting as well, so there's multiple clinics as well that coordinate on this and try to maximize the support.
Another question, what's the situation of LGBTIQ?
So the situation with regards to that community is that given Myanmar's quite traditional patriarchal culture role, there are specific provisions that that targets LGBTI community in Myanmar. So one of the projects that we worked on last semester and worked with our partners on the ground was looking at specific penal code provisions that, they have sodomy law still. On addition to which they have administrative laws such as the Yangon Police Act, which has a provision that's routinely called the darkness law, where if a police comes upon individuals, two individuals who they deemed are not supposed to be where they're supposed to be under the guise of darkness, they have the full discretion to arrest them. And the darkness law is almost always routinely used against the LGBTI community. It targets trans women, and it's a real tool that, because it gives so much wide discretion to the police authorities with little to no oversight, for them to then arrest individuals. We've worked with survivors who tell tales of, brutally being beaten, sexually assaulted, harassed for money, all under this tool, which is not even no criminal charges have been laid against them, but they use this arbitrary temporary arrest to be denied of due process rights. And what we're working with our partner, who's Colors Rainbows, on this project is looking at that, linking them with human rights lawyers on the ground. And in fact, the students and I think earlier in one of the slides you would have seen was a training that we did. First of all, analyzing the law, sharing our findings, showing cases where other countries with sodomy laws have been able to eliminate them, offering suggestions. We also, on this recent trip with the students, helped develop protocols, know your rights manual for the community that could be circulated, as well as having a phone tree of legal assistance. If somebody gets arrested, this is the lawyer who agreed to take this call. So setting up those kind of things is what we've done on it. And on this trip, it was great to convene and have linkages and partnership between, the traditional lawyers who would normally not be talking about LGBTI community, to work then with the community and create that. And after we left, there was a case actually where a transgendered woman was returning from Bangkok from operations and was simply arrested at the airport for whoever knows, perhaps due to corruption. Somebody had told them this individual was arrested, and it was a very sad example of what is wrong with the targeting of LGBTI and vulnerable communities. But what made me at least optimistic was immediately upon arrest, the community that we had set up helped create those protocols, kicked into gear. They started issuing press statements. Representing lawyers were lining up at police station, and that case became so high profile that eventually this individual was released and charges were unfounded. So there is room for optimism, even despite of everything here.
Another question. Can you discuss how British colonial history affects military and civilian attitudes in transition to democracy?
This is a big question. So we covered some of the history, but the history that we didn't cover will take you back before World War II to British rule. So the British ruled the country for almost more than a century. The first wars were in the early 1800s, but a lot of the laws that are now being reviewed and repealed actually date to the colonial period. So I think there's a couple of different things that the way the colonial period actually affects the current discussion. One is that the British would actually work with certain groups more than others. So the administration was filled by certain groups. And so some of that animosity that actually led to distrust after World War II stems from the colonial period and can be traced to the Civil War and the lack of peace. So that's one legacy. And I think the other is this legal legacy, that there are certain laws that are on the books that they are quite old in the way that they interpret certain standards, or they're vague, so they can actually lead to practices where there's so much discretion that it can lead to abuse of interpretations, either by the administrators, which means the military for years, or by the courts. So those are two legacies that are still there.
And I think one thing to highlight for our listeners is the fact that, you know, one of the institutions that was really particularly hit hard under the military rules and those periods was the legal institution. The judiciary had no discretion whatsoever. They were not set up to function that way, but I've literally, and that legacy is still very much alive today. The civilians don't know what their rights are or what the laws are at play. I'll give you an example of the prolific nature. Here we've got all these archaic laws that are from the turn of the century, and they're enacting new laws, but there's no concept of conflict of laws or even striking down old statutes. So you've got certain areas of law where there are 8 statutes related to something, and yet every day there's new laws coming up, and there's no direct procedures that have been undertaken about that. And then going back to the judiciary, you know, because the legal system was completely dismantled, you're dealing with judges who are not used to applying the law to the facts and having that independence. I have been in situations, been in courtrooms where, you know, all the evidence has been presented from the government side as well as the defense side, cases where based on evidence alone would have led to a favorable result for, say, the political defendant. But literally the judge is looking and waiting for an envelope, which eventually arrives. He opens that envelope, reads it, and goes guilty, as if everything that preceded it, all the exhibits, everything that's been entered is not even at play.
So a follow-up question is, what is being done to rebuild the judiciary, to make it independent, and to grow the capacity and role of lawyers there?
I think we'll both have something to say, but maybe I can start this one, and then you can talk about some of the networks that you're involved with, which is building these legal networks. I thought I would just kind of highlight another kind of example of what's being done. First, there are lawyers who have been there fighting in these courts despite their problems for years. Even before the recent elections, there were lawyers inside the country doing what they could, incredibly brave lawyers doing that. So that's there. And so what they basically know is how to use this system to the best they can. Often what you're doing is trying to mitigate the harm of the legal system. So a case that the clinic was involved in trying to support by highlighting the issues was a case out of Htun state, so in the north, where a military unit had come into a village, and the military had killed a young Kachin woman, a teenager, and the father complained about it. This is under the Thein Sein regime, and so brought complaints, and then the military officers involved brought a criminal defamation case against him for bringing the complaint. And so the court was being used as an oppressive tool, and what did we do? We worked with local lawyers and tried to highlight that case, and he was eventually convicted, but he was given a very small, relatively speaking, fine, and so he didn't have to serve for it. And so there were probably a mitigating factor by highlighting this, the case and the problems with having a criminal defamation case where your own daughter was killed and then you complain about it. So that's the kind of things where you get down to these individual cases that make a difference in individual lives.
And also just going back to this idea of using law and to get really, for the efforts that we are trying to do is to say that yes, we've got this period, all the more important for us to work with communities, to work with lawyers, to seize that opportunity, to start doing strategic litigation for law reform. The concept of strategic litigation and law reform using the courts is a completely foreign concept. It has never been done. The fact that it was done at some period in time before, perhaps, in the brief period of democracy, but Myanmar as it's right now, the legal system as of right now, that idea does not exist. It's just very much cases go according to this. The concept of precedents don't really apply either. It's sort of very much checking in the box, like this is how my senior lawyer did it, so I will learn to do it only this way. Very within the box. We're trying to explore areas where we can use the law again, trying to restore people's faith in the justice system. It got to be, we have to see it as a tool that you can enshrine your rights, a tool that you can test and push for it, and not so much seen as a tool of oppression, which is what it's been so long. So, yeah.
We have a number of questions around this issue. I think many were surprised by the non-response, or at least the slow, muted response by the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, given her general image as a human rights advocate and hero to the violence against the Rohingya. What insight can you offer into this? Was she personally indifferent to this, or was it political realities that kept her silent?
I think we could both fill in on with this regards to it. I think one of the hopes that we were trying to do with the presentation was to show examples of the real structural barriers in place. I think her role as a human rights defender, her belief as an activist, no doubt. I think that this is something that is an issue that's of importance, but given the realities that the Myanmar society, that's quite divisive and also has right now a real surge in nationalistic attitudes. It's essentially, in the lead up to the elections, those of us who are in the human rights field kept thinking, like, why isn't there a denouncement? Why isn't there anything? And I think the truth is, to denounce and to condemn and to take an active action leading up to the election could have probably potentially cost. You know, I am not trying to sugarcoat it in the sense that it is fairly traditional racist communities at play. There is a surge in ultranationalism. This has been the history throughout the country. You know, at brief periods of time, a foreign threat is somehow raised, and it's a way in which the instability is maintained. It just happens to be in the 70s it was the Chinese Burmese community. Later on in the 80s it was Hindu. Different phases, even the ethnic armed groups were, as I mentioned in my childhood, being portrayed as this. It just so happens that right now the community that's affected and targeted is the Rohingya. And knowing all those and the fact that the civilian government doesn't have the ability to make changes. So for instance, citizenship law is one area where this situation could be remedied, but the ministry that's responsible for citizenship and borders and that is not under the control of the government at all. That's firmly under Minister of Home Affairs and firmly under the Commander-in-Chief.
And I think that covers most of it. I think I would add two short points. One is that I think the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi is not speaking out in rights terms shows the limits of her power as a politician right now. That's the first. Whether that is coming from her individually or as these structural things, the reality is she's not speaking out, so there's some constraint. The second is that I think that politics and human rights don't need to be mutually exclusive. To say you're a politician, which is what she says, doesn't mean she can't talk about human rights. But in Burma, still rights is considered to be kind of political and not something that would necessarily be associated with the rule of law in the way that we would want it to be if there's structural change, where all politicians can talk about a culture of rights, and that is not a political statement. It is one which can stand up for the rights of the Rohingya, the Kachin, and the Burmese majority, and the next generations to come. That's where we need to head.
Amazing work, Tyler and Yi. Thank you for this great presentation. This concludes our first HLeX program for the 2017 calendar year. I hope you will join us next time, and please stay tuned for the announcement of our next HLeX Open Lecture. You can access today's recording or register for future lectures on our website, alumni.law.harvard.edu/HLeX. And be sure to fill out the short survey we will email you about today's event to give us feedback and help shape future programs. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.